In a world of swords and magic, the protagonist, Rent, is one of countless ordinary adventurers. As a poor individual, he has to wake up very early to make a living, while only the wealthy nobles sleep until noon. The reason Rent, a free-spirited adventurer, has to wake up early is to look for quests. In the Adventurers Guild, adventurers who arrive early can freely choose quests that suit their level before others take them. These quests may include hunting magical beasts, protecting clients, or gathering herbs and materials. Before choosing a quest for himself, Rent greets and exchanges pleasantries with another team of adventurers he knows. They have already picked their quests and are about to leave, while Rent still hasn't found a quest for himself. Most adventurers team up, but Rent prefers to work alone. He feels left behind, even though he has been an adventurer for 10 years, still stuck at the bronze level. Despite this, he can still hunt magical beasts and sell their crystals to the guild to cover his living expenses. Rent is a careful person, always saving money in case of an emergency. Afterward, he enters a dungeon and proceeds alone to the deepest part of it. Unexpectedly, he encounters a wall that has been broken through by some creature, thinking it might be a hidden passage. Believing he has stumbled upon a big opportunity, Rent decides to take the risk and venture inside. He soon realizes that this is an unexplored area and quietly hopes to find valuable items here. He should have returned and reported his discovery to the guild for reward, but due to his greed, he chooses to venture deeper. Eventually, he comes face to face with a dragon, the strongest creature among magical beasts. While the dragon seems strange, Rent cannot mistake the overwhelming pressure it emits. Unable to move under its pressure, Rent is devoured by the dragon. However, somehow, Rent survives, but now reduced to nothing but a skeleton. Rent is now an undead, and he could be considered immortal. However, if exposed to the cleansing magic of the church, he would certainly die, as a living skeleton goes against the natural laws of the gods. Unsure of what to do, Rent considers returning to the guild, but he knows that if he does, he will either be killed or captured and sent to the church for purification. In his panic, he notices that the dragon is no longer around, so he decides to leave first. Although many researchers have studied the origin and structure of dungeon monsters, the existence of monsters in dungeons remains a mystery. Rent decides to wait for explorers to arrive to exchange information. But for now, he needs to get used to his skeletal body. He realizes he still can't speak normally. Soon after, he encounters another skeleton. He picks up his sword and finds that his body is heavier, lacking muscles, and his stamina has significantly decreased. He charges at the skeleton but falls backward due to the sword's weight. The skeleton stumbles as well and tries to fix its fallen leg. Rent realizes that he can no longer rely on traditional swordsmanship. He decides to use his mana to enhance his body and is able to wield the sword and defeat the skeleton. Suddenly, a beam of light from the skeleton transfers to Rent. He recalls his scholar friend mentioning that monsters in dungeons evolve differently from humans. While humans must train and endure hardships to grow stronger, monsters like skeletons have a chance of becoming undead and then evolving into demons. Rent thinks that if he becomes a demon and covers his body with a cloak, he could return to the city. He sets his goal to hunt monsters in the dungeon to evolve and return to the city. Not long after, Rent had defeated 5 skeletons. He noticed that the light from each skeleton he defeated could help him recover. As a result, he could continuously use his Kai to fight and get more familiar with this new fighting style. He then discovered a slime, which was considered a weak monster on par with the skeletons. However, the slime was Rent's natural enemy at this moment, as it only feared magic, while Rent had only learned physical attack techniques and never studied magic. The only way he could defeat the slime was by striking its core or damaging it to the point where it couldn't recover. Rent recklessly swung his sword and, by chance, hit the slime's core. Although the slime attacked by firing acid, the liquid from the slime after it died no longer contained acid. Instead, it was used to make cosmetics for women, as it helped keep the skin smooth. Meanwhile, at the Adventurers Guild, the receptionist was being asked by her colleague how the new recruit was doing. She mentioned that she had planned to ask Rent to guide the new recruit, but since Rent hadn't returned since yesterday, the new recruit had gone to the dungeon to earn money while waiting for Rent. After spending a day in the dungeon, Rent realized that he no longer felt hungry or tired. Though his evolution was still slow, at least his stamina had returned to its previous state. He had also become more accustomed to using magic. In addition, he was now able to use holy magic, even in his skeletal form. This magic could heal, purify water, and preserve food. Rent wanted to preserve some bread to prevent it from going bad, just in case he needed it later. He decided to continue cautiously hunting monsters. If he encountered 1 to 3 monsters, he could still fight. But if there were more, he would have to run. Rent realized that despite being an adventurer for 10 years, he was still too weak. He knew he wasn't suited for this line of work. A normal person would only work as an adventurer for a few years before retiring and finding another job, but Rent held on to the belief that as long as he survived, he would continue being an adventurer, training every day. His persistence came from a dream of becoming a high-level adventurer, one who would be capable of saving an entire nation. He didn't give up, even though he was now just a skeleton. He continued to hunt monsters and noticed that he seemed stronger now than he had been as a human. Rent was about to collect some liquid from the slime when, unexpectedly, the light from it transferred to him, causing him to undergo his first evolution. Rent became a zombie with flesh, although not fully restored. He was now able to speak, but his speech was still unclear. He realized that this evolution had benefits and decided to continue hunting monsters diligently. Rent then started hunting higher-level creatures like goblins. Now that he was a zombie, his movements were more agile, and his ki and magic had increased, making it easier for him to fight. He easily defeated 2 goblins and realized that he was much stronger than when he was human. Not long after, Rent discovered a human in the dungeon. He decided to remain hidden for fear that the girl would either run away in fear or attack him. He recognized her as a new recruit, as he was familiar with most adventurers in the city. After observing her for a while, Rent realized that although she had been trained in swordsmanship, she lacked experience and wasn't good at observing her surroundings. A skeleton then suddenly attacked her, pushing her into a corner. She tried to fight back, but the skeleton grabbed her sword. Rent had no choice but to step out and help. He appeared behind the skeleton and struck it down with his sword. Afterward, he approached the girl and greeted her, but she was still very startled and afraid of him. Rent introduced himself and threw his sword away to show that he meant her no harm. He then told her that he had died and been turned into this form. The girl then asked Rent if he planned to kill her if she left, to which he denied, stating that he had no such intention. He then asked her to help him buy some clothes to cover his body, as he wanted to return to the city. Rent gave her money and asked her to buy the clothes, promising that he would give her the remaining balance. The girl introduced herself as Rena and said that she would repay Rent's kindness as the daughter of a knight family. Rent then led Rena to the entrance of the dungeon and let her leave, with Rena promising to return and help him. Rent noticed that Rena was still cautious around him, but he understood that it was necessary for an adventurer to be wary. He was also worried that Rena might report him to the guild, but he decided not to dwell on it and let things unfold. Rena then returned to the guild and went to see the receptionist, while Rent continued hunting monsters and accumulating strength to evolve. He soon noticed that Rena had come back. She called out to him, and Rent showed himself. However, she was still unsure and drew her sword to ask him. Rent explained that in the lower levels, he was the only zombie, and real zombies were found in higher levels. Rena mentioned that she had brought the clothes for him and returned the extra money. Rent checked the clothes and found them to be large enough to cover his body. Rena had also bought bandages to help him wrap his hands and legs to conceal them. After putting on the clothes, Rent realized that his face was still exposed, so Rena had prepared a mask for him. When Rent tried it on, the mask unexpectedly stuck to his face. He realized that the mask was cursed and couldn't be removed, even with holy magic. The rest of his clothes had been bought with the receptionist's help in finding a place to buy them. However, the mask was something Rena had found from a street vendor, and she regretted not being suspicious of the unusually cheap price. She felt guilty, but Rent didn't blame her. He thought that all he needed to do was earn money and ask a high-level mage to lift the curse. Rena now realized that Rent was a kind person and decided not to fear or be wary of him anymore. They both left the dungeon together. Rent learned about Rena's background and understood that she came from a different city, but had moved here to study and become an adventurer. Recently, 2 dungeons had been discovered and were being explored. When they reached the city gate, Rent grew a bit anxious because he would be forced to show his pass, but he no longer looked the same as before. Rena wanted to lead him through another gate, but Rent didn't want to cause her any more trouble. He worried that if he was exposed, Rena would be investigated for bringing a monster into the city. However, she felt indebted to Rent for saving her life and still wanted to help him, both now and in the future. Rent then went to the city gate and showed his adventurer's badge to pass through. Rena gave the excuse that Rent had been attacked by monsters and was injured, so he wanted a mask to hide his injuries. Unfortunately, the mask was cursed, and Rent couldn't remove it. The soldiers also tried to remove the mask but couldn't, so Rent had no choice but to hire a holy mage to lift the curse. Once they entered the city, Rent thanked Rena and unexpectedly vanished. He didn't want to be involved with her any longer because he knew that she would soon mature and become a more capable adventurer than him. He planned to wait until he resembled his human form more before apologizing to her. Rent couldn't ask Rena for help anymore, so he turned to his scholar friend, Vivi. When Vivi heard Rent's voice, she thought he had come to visit her as usual, but Rent was different from the usual. Vivi had to ask him what had happened in the dungeon. After hearing Rent's story, she found it hard to believe that he had been eaten by a dragon and turned into a zombie. The dragon seemed to have left the dungeon by now. Vivi found this suspicious, but everything Rent said was now standing right before her. She then asked him if he was really the Rent she knew. Rent couldn't be certain, as he only had Rent's memories and consciousness, but he wasn't sure if this body was truly his original one. Vivi then asked what Rent planned to do next. He still wanted to continue being an adventurer. However, Rent couldn't use his current appearance at the guild, so he asked Vivi to take on a quest for him. In return, she allowed him to stay at her place, but she insisted that he let her study him. Rent agreed, as long as she didn't dissect him. The next morning, Vivi took the magic stones and slime that Rent had collected to sell, making a decent amount of money. Rent decided to use the money to buy a new sword from a blacksmith shop. When he went out in his suspicious appearance, he drew quite a bit of attention. He then went to the blacksmith shop, where the shopkeeper was a bit surprised by his appearance. Rent took out his sword and asked the blacksmith to forge a new one for him. The shopkeeper examined the sword and noticed that Rent had likely used both physical strength and magic in his battles. After asking Rent about his budget, she realized that he had enough money to afford a good quality sword. She asked for half of the payment up front and the rest after the sword was finished, since it would take some time to forge. She asked for contact information to notify Rent when the sword was ready. Rent told her to contact Vivi. Vivi, meanwhile, was researching and discovered that zombies typically arose from corpses and most zombies would lose their reason and emotions once revived. This made Rent, in his current state, a special case. She couldn't conclude anything about Rent's situation yet, but she thought that even though she wasn't sure if this zombie was truly Rent from before, his consciousness seemed to remain the same, which led her to accept that he was indeed Rent. Years ago, Vivi had been known as the youngest scholar in history. She had chosen to become an adventurer and was directly promoted to the silver rank. During her first herb gathering trip, a man had told her to bring Rent along. While in the forest gathering herbs, she asked Rent to help her store the herbs in her bag. She then realized Rent had already gathered a whole crate of herbs before she even finished. The two of them then encountered a monster, and Rent told Vivi to use magic while he shielded her. With just one strike, she defeated the monster. Rent realized this was Vivi's first time experiencing real combat. As they took a break, Vivi noticed how skilled Rent was at gathering herbs. He told her that in addition to reading and writing, one needed knowledge of plants and monsters, and whatever could be learned should be learned, because they never knew when it would come in handy. For the first time, Vivi, a great scholar, had to ask a regular person like Rent to teach her. From then on, the two became close, and over the next 10 years, Rent continued to level up, while Vivi kept watching his back. That afternoon, Rent returned home from the blacksmith shop. The blacksmith couple gave him a temporary sword to use. As he left, the couple sensed that Rent was still a good person. They believed he must have encountered some issue related to a curse and didn't want to trouble them, which was why he hadn't spoken about it. However, they trusted him enough to make weapons for him and would wait for the time when he was ready to share his story. That evening, Rent had dinner with Vivi. She noticed that Rent seemed not to be hungry and didn't need to eat. Rent, however, was determined to continue evolving into a form more like his human self. Vivi thought that if Rent continued focusing on monster hunting, it wouldn't be much different from how things were before. The next day, Rent entered the dungeon and encountered a man struggling with a slime. He decided to help and noticed that the man seemed to be an amateur. Rent then walked away, thinking that adventurers entering dungeons should be responsible for their own lives. And if they died, it was their own fault. He didn't want to get involved with this man, fearing it might be a setup to trick rescuers and steal their belongings. The man then ran up to him, asking to be Rent's teammate. The man explained that he was a new adventurer and couldn't fight monsters properly. He had originally been a cook with a stable job, but because of debt, he had decided to risk everything by entering the dungeon to pay it off. He had asked other teams to join them, but had been rejected, so he was now in the dungeon alone. However, Rent still apologized, explaining that he wasn't available to help. He felt that unless the cook found some high-level treasure, he might not be able to pay off his debt. Just as the cook was about to give up, Rent unexpectedly told him to follow him and help carry his things. Rent then noticed the wound on the cook's hand, which triggered some strange emotions in him. Though he still felt something wasn't quite right, Rent chose to go along with the cook. He led the cook to a secret passage he had discovered earlier. Once inside, Rent realized that the dragon had indeed left. While examining the surroundings, the cook unexpectedly found another secret passage. He thought that if he reported it to the guild, he could make a decent sum of money. But he had no intention of taking credit for Rent's discovery. Rent encouraged him to take the credit and not hold back, as Rent wanted to go deeper into the dungeon. The two of them eventually found an empty room, and Rent noticed a magical circle on the floor. However, the cook didn't see it and stepped into the circle, causing him to be teleported away. Rent immediately realized it was a teleportation spell and feared the cook might have been sent to a dangerous place, confident that he could now handle the danger. Rent followed and was teleported to another room, where he found the cook unconscious. Nearby was a massive skeleton, which Rent immediately recognized as the dungeon's boss. He drew his sword and rushed to attack, but his strikes didn't cause any damage. Even after enhancing the sword with magic, the attacks still had no effect. There was no exit, so Rent realized the only way out was to defeat the boss. He knew that he had no choice but to use holy magic, though he feared the sword might not hold up for long. He enhanced the sword with holy magic and struck, breaking the boss's leg. This gave him the opportunity to deliver the final blow. Afterward, the cook woke up and saw Rent. Rent used holy magic to heal the cook and gave him the magic stone dropped by the boss. Rent was certain that the stone would be enough to help the cook pay off his debts. However, he had some conditions for the cook. Rent told him about his condition and explained that he couldn't join the guild due to his current appearance, so he asked the cook to sell the magic stone for him. The second condition was that Rent wanted to eat for free at the cook's restaurant. Rent then led the cook to the exit of the room. Sure enough, the cook didn't see the teleportation circle at the wall earlier, but when they took a different route, the cook was able to leave the room. Rent took some time to examine the surroundings before returning. Once they reached the city, the cook took Rent to his restaurant. The cook's wife was overjoyed to see that her husband was safe. The cook told her about the help Rent had given him, though his wife was still worried that her husband might have been tricked. The cook reassured her, speaking highly of Rent and explaining that the only cost was that Rent could eat for free at their restaurant. The cook introduced himself as Loris, and his wife as Isabel. They both bowed to thank Rent and asked for his name. Rent told Loras's name and asked him to keep it a secret. Rent then returned to Vivi's house, and that's when he started experiencing strange symptoms. His vision gradually blurred, but he managed to walk inside. Vivi asked him where he had put the letter from the elders of the Empire, but Rent suddenly approached and hugged her. Then, the mask partially vanished, and Rent bit into Vivi's shoulder. She quickly pushed him away and, realizing he still had his consciousness intact, used magic to subdue him. Rent woke up and immediately apologized to Vivi for what had happened. Vivi told him not to worry about it, as she was fine, and asked him to explain what had occurred. Rent told her that he had encountered a man in the dungeon and began feeling an unusual hunger for him. However, Rent pushed those emotions aside and returned home, where he found Vivi also very appetizing. This caused him to be overwhelmed by his instincts and bite her. Vivi had partly predicted this outcome, as Rent was still a zombie who craved human flesh and blood. Rent then asked to see Vivi's wound, and he tried using holy magic to heal her. After one attempt, the pain from Vivi's wound was gone, but the scar remained. Rent exerted himself to use the magic once more, and this time, the wound completely vanished. Vivi then noticed that Rent's mask had changed. Rent was now able to shift his mask into two forms, one that covered his eyes and one that covered his mouth. It seemed that the mask had its own will, and Rent could control it. However, when Vivi tried to remove it, she couldn't. Vivi then realized that Rent had evolved into a new form, a half-demon, which was essentially a lower-tier vampire. Rent didn't know when he had evolved, as there had been no change when he defeated the skeletal boss. It was likely that he had changed after biting Vivi. Vivi couldn't explain exactly why Rent had evolved into a half-demon, but she had a theory. Originally, Rent had been a skeleton, and later evolved into a zombie. But zombies weren't the only possible evolution for skeletons. There were reports of other forms like skeleton knights or archers. So, it was possible that the evolution was based on the individual's desires. Rent had always held the belief that he must become something more human-like. Rent wondered why he had evolved into a half-demon and not a full vampire. Vivi suggested that the evolution process was similar to leveling up in the Adventurers Guild. He couldn't skip stages, but had to level up gradually. Rent believed that if he continued to push for evolution, he would eventually become a vampire, and from there, turn into a human. Vivi could guarantee that he would become a vampire, but she wasn't sure if he could turn into a human afterward. The future evolutions wouldn't come from simply defeating ordinary monsters. But for now, these were just her theories, and Rent should proceed slowly, with Vivi supporting him to the best of her ability. Vivi then wanted to conduct an experiment on Rent. She planned to draw his current body to observe any future changes, and if possible, she wanted to ask for a piece of his flesh. If Rent felt any pain, she had anesthetic available. She also intended to try other experiments. Rent, however, wanted to postpone until the next day, as it was already late. The next day, Rent found that the sword he had borrowed from the blacksmith was broken. So he took it to the forge to apologize. The blacksmith told him not to break the sword like that, as materials were scarce. Rent explained that he had encountered the giant skeleton boss in a hidden area of the dungeon. The blacksmith sympathized with Rent and wanted to help him continue exploring the hidden area, as he didn't want Rent to be abandoned like before. He offered Rent another, better sword, since Rent was a close friend of his. On the way back to the dungeon, Rent noticed that Loras and his wife were shopping for supplies to reopen their restaurant. In the following days, Rent helped Vivi with her experiments. Though Rent didn't understand alchemy very well, he was somewhat apprehensive about the experiments Vivi might conduct on him. Rent tried drinking some of the poison Vivi had made, and it didn't seem to affect him at all. However, recovery potions and beneficial medicines did work on him. Rent didn't feel sleepy or fatigued, but he did experience a growing craving for human blood and flesh. Vivi then gave Rent a vial of her blood to drink whenever he was on the verge of losing control. Just a drop helped soothe his hunger significantly. The next morning, Rent mentioned that he wanted to go to the guild to take on a quest. However, Vivi pointed out that in his current state, he would attract attention. Even though Rent was a bronze-ranked adventurer, the guild had a high opinion of him because of his significant contributions and vast knowledge. The guild had considered offering him a position, but since Rent had no intention of retiring, they hadn't made any formal proposal yet. But now, Rent knew that in order to level up, he needed achievements. The way to gain achievements was by taking on quests himself. So, Vivi came up with another idea. Rent could use a different identity to start leveling up from scratch. Rent then went to the guild and sought out Sheila, the receptionist he was closest to. When he met her, Rent requested to register as an adventurer. As they were preparing the paperwork, Rent was filled with nostalgia for 10 years ago, when he had just started his career. However, his current goal remained unchanged from the past. Rent decided to use his old name, but changed his last name. Sheila was a bit surprised by the name Rent, since the Rent she knew had disappeared a few days ago. Rent explained that he was a relative of Vivi and was currently living at her house. Sheila had heard rumors about someone moving into Vivi's house recently. She then proceeded to handle the paperwork, and Rent felt that telling her he was Vivi's relative was the right choice, as he didn't want Vivi to get caught up in any bad rumors. Rent then received his adventurer's badge and made his way to the dungeon. Along the way, He encountered a young adventurer couple and thought they would be able to handle things themselves. If it had been him in the past, he would have gone over to guide and assist them. But now, as a newcomer, he didn't want to attract too much attention. Rent decided to head toward his secret passage before anyone else discovered it. As he entered the teleportation room, he went deeper into the dungeon and came upon a stone room, which seemed to be the living space of someone who had once lived there, as there was a skeleton inside. Suddenly, a girl in a cloak appeared and asked what he was doing there. She assumed Rent was there to steal something and immediately cast an attack on him. Fortunately, because Rent was a half-demon, only his belongings were burned, and his body sustained only minor injuries. The girl then realized why Rent had been able to reach this place. She understood that she had misunderstood him, so she approached and apologized to Rent. She decided to give him her cloak and asked that he never tell anyone about this place, as it was very important to her. In exchange, she gave him a magical map that would automatically record the locations Rent had visited. After their agreement, the girl teleported Rent outside the dungeon. Rent then returned home and told Vivi about his encounter. She remarked that it seemed like he was cursed, constantly getting involved in strange situations. As for the map, Vivi couldn't make much use of it, so Rent tried to channel mana into it. Sure enough, the map lit up and began drawing a detailed path through the dungeon, even marking the positions of others in the dungeon. Vivi considered the map to be extremely valuable, on par with a national treasure. Rent tried to see if the map recorded other dungeons, but it appeared that it wasn't fully detailed for other areas. He recalled the girl had said the map would only record the places he had visited. Rent also wanted to check if the cloak was cursed, and Vivi confirmed that the cloak was indeed special. It had high resistance to magic, and ordinary weapons couldn't penetrate it. Rent decided to return to the room the next day, as the girl had only forbidden him from telling others about it, not from visiting. Though he knew the girl didn't want outsiders to intrude, he wanted to go back and meet her again. However, the next day, when Rent tried to find the secret passage, it was blocked. The map also didn't show the location anymore, so Rent realized that the girl had sealed off the passage to prevent him from finding her again. Meanwhile, Sheila at the guild was worried about Rent, as she hadn't heard anything from him for a while. Rent unexpectedly returned and told Sheila he wanted to take on a quest to defeat orcs. She didn't recommend this quest for a new adventurer, but Rent was confident that he had enough experience fighting orcs. Shortly afterward, Rent returned with 3 pieces of orc meat in his magic bag to complete the quest. Sheila then asked Rent to stay for a moment. Rent, now having attracted the attention of other adventurers, was noticed because, despite being a newcomer, he had already been able to defeat orcs. Sheila later returned and asked Rent if he wanted to take the advancement exam, and of course, Rent eagerly wanted to do so. That night, Vivi asked Rent what name he used to register as an adventurer. He revealed that he had used Vivi's surname because he didn't want others to speak ill of her while he was staying there. However, Vivi didn't care much about such things. Soon after, Rent attended the advancement exam. He noticed there were many people there, and those who could read were sent to take the written test. These tests were no challenge for Rent, as they were too easy for him. He realized that many people had come to the exam, including the rookie girl he had met earlier. After the written tests, many people had to leave, while Rent achieved a perfect score. Sheila then came to inform Rent that for the practical exam, he would have to complete a quest for the guild. Rent was paired with 2 rookies, Rai and Laura, whom he had met before. After the introductions, the guild assigned them a task. All teams had to reach a designated location on the dungeon map. There were no rules, so they could do whatever they wanted. The team that reached the destination first would receive a reward. Everyone realized that this was a race. They were then taken to the dungeon entrance, which was different from the one Rent was used to. He told Rai and Laura to go by a map, because the map provided by the guild had been published 15 years ago, so the actual layout might have changed. Rent went to a nearby shop to buy a map, and because the full map was expensive, he requested only the map for the first floor. Indeed, the map he bought was quite different from the one given by the guild. The shop owner advised Rai and Laura to listen to Rent, as he seemed experienced. Rent also informed them that the guild had intentionally given them an old map as a challenge, and that the guild was quite malicious. The 3 of them then entered the dungeon and encountered a group of skeletons. Rai and Laura immediately showed that they weren't weak, which made Rent realize that they were capable and knew how to cooperate well. After dealing with the skeletons, Rent discovered a bag that had a very foul smell, likely used to lure the monsters. He then noticed an ambush ahead and identified the enemy as humans. Rent carefully approached and blocked an attack from the hidden ambusher. He left this person to Rai while he dealt with two others, a swordsman and a mage. Rai seemed to be struggling more with the swordsman, so Laura used magic to restrain him, and Rai then shoved him into a wall, allowing Laura to throw stones at him. Rai soon realized that these were also participants in the exam, and they had tried to ambush them to fail the test, as the examiners had stated that they could use any means necessary. Rent then told Rai and Laura that dungeons were unpredictable and they needed to be extremely cautious. As they continued, Rent ordered someone hiding in the shadows to come out and clean up. A cloaked figure stepped forward, and it turned out that they were all people sent by the guild to make the exam harder for the participants. Meanwhile, the guild master informed Sheila that he found Rent suspicious because someone new had such formidable strength. He wanted Sheila to report everything she could about Rent. Rent's group had now reached the boss room, but another team arrived first and wanted to go ahead. Rent saw that they were deliberately trying to pick a fight, so he drew his sword to intimidate them. They backed down, knowing better than to cause trouble. Rent then allowed them to go first, but not long after, the other team ran out of the dungeon. Rent wanted to show Rai and Laura something, and as soon as the other team ran out, they were escorted by guild personnel. Rent told Rai and Laura that they wouldn't die in this exam, but it was still a lesson. If you can't win, it's better to retreat than to fight recklessly. Every adventurer would face a terrifying shock at some point, and whether they could rise up after that shock was what determined how strong an adventurer truly was. Rai understood and decided to follow Rent into the boss room. As soon as they entered, the two of them discovered that the boss was a high-level slime, which explained why the previous group couldn't overcome it. Rent explained that there was still a way to defeat it, but since they had encountered the boss, he wanted to test his strength. He believed that to become stronger, one had to engage in tough battles to push their abilities. Rai, as the vanguard, charged forward and dodged the attack well. However, he couldn't strike at the core of the slime. Immediately, Rai was thrown back. Despite the intense pain, Rai forced himself to stay on his feet to give Laura time to cast a spell. In this battle, Laura was the key to defeating the slime, and Rai needed to stall for time. Before they entered, Rent had already discussed the strategy with them, so they proceeded according to plan. Rent believed that if they performed well, they could defeat the boss, but he would assist them a little to prevent them from being seriously injured. Once Laura finished casting her spell, she signaled for everyone to retreat. She used Fireball to attack the slime, which was weak to fire due to its water-based nature, tipping the odds in Rent's group's favor. This was the first time the two rookies had defeated a boss, and the materials from the slime could be sold for a lot of money, so they decided to stay and gather them, disregarding the other participants who had passed. Laura realized that reaching the goal first didn't matter much. As long as they reached it within the allowed time, they would pass the exam. Moreover, there were many traps ahead, so they could let the others act as decoys while they safely made their way to the goal. Rai also understood that the guild had set up these traps to help improve adventurers' skills. Without strength and the right mindset, they would easily be defeated by monsters. To their surprise, they were the first team to complete the challenge. The two rookies had become wiser by having someone at the guild verify their identities before trusting them. The reward was nothing special, just an immediate promotion to the next rank and a few healing potions. After completing the exam, Rent told the two rookies to follow him, since neither of them had ever been to the second floor of the dungeon. He wanted to show them around. They were shocked to find that the second floor had sunlight and different types of plants. This was where they would have to fight if they continued being adventurers, so they needed to be mentally prepared from the start. The journey back to the guild was tiring, as the guild still had traps set up to test them. But Rent and his group managed to make it through. After handing over their certification to Sheila, the three of them were promoted to copper rank adventurers. Sheila's younger brother, who had been watching them during the exam, also came to confirm their progress. The guild not only evaluated the participants based on their strength, but also their character. In their case, they received perfect scores in both aspects. Rent later learned that Rai and Laura had defied their families to become adventurers, which reminded him of his own past. By the end of the day, Rent and the two rookies had to say goodbye. Rent had his own path to follow, and so did they. He wished them the best, but reminded them that a teacher for a day is a teacher for life, so they would never forget the lessons he taught them that day. After bidding farewell to the two rookies, Sheila had a conversation with Rent about the person she had known before. Being sharp, Rent understood that she had figured out his true identity. Sheila invited him to a quiet place to talk, and Rent, cautious of what the guild might do, asked if this was an order from the guild. If it was, he would never return to the guild again. Sheila admitted that the guild had indeed tasked her with investigating him, but what she wanted to do came from her own will, not the guild's. Rent reluctantly followed her to a private place, where he would explain the serious matters about himself. He knew that this could have consequences for both sides, so he asked her to keep it a secret for safety. Sheila agreed to use a magical pact on herself, binding her to secrecy. If she revealed it, she would be punished by the pact and would immediately leave the guild. Sheila's actions stemmed from her desire to help Rent in the same way Rent had once helped her become the diligent guild employee she was today. Hearing this, Rent agreed to form the magical pact. He then removed his hat to reveal his face to her, as he didn't know where to begin explaining, and this seemed like the simplest way. Sheila was utterly shocked upon seeing Rent's face. It was no longer human, but that of a demon. For now, Rent decided to leave the matter unresolved, so she could take her time to process it. A straightforward explanation would not suffice for something so unbelievable. As he was about to leave, Sheila declared that she would do her best to help him. No matter what Rent had become, she trusted that his inherently kind nature meant he would never harm humans. She assured him that if he faced any issues related to the guild, she would handle them. The two of them returned home that night, where Vivi noticed that Rent had revealed his secret to Sheila. Returning to the main topic, Vivi wondered aloud if Sheila wasn't afraid of being implicated in something so dangerous. Sheila, however, expressed no fear. Vivi subtly hinted at Rent's current state as a flesh-eating monster, but Sheila still decided to stay and help him. Pleased by her determination, Vivi felt a sense of mutual trust had been established and invited Sheila to stay for dinner. During dinner, Sheila mentioned that Rent had recently gained a bit of fame. There had been a series of disappearances involving adventurers that weren't caused by monsters, and the guild master suspected they might be kidnappings. Rent's sudden appearance as an unusual individual only fueled suspicion. The situation was complicated, and Sheila promised to explain things to the guild master to alleviate his concerns. In the meantime, Rent would avoid visiting the guild to let the rumors die down. A few days later, the guild master asked Sheila about her investigation. Sheila explained that Rent's nature was just as kind and trustworthy as the Rent they had known before, which reassured the guild master. Several days after that, Rent left the house early one morning, which worried Vivi. She questioned why he would go out so soon after agreeing to avoid the guild for a while. In truth, Rent had gone to the blacksmith shop to test a weapon. The sword he had ordered was finally ready. The blacksmith, familiar with Rent's preferences, had adjusted the design for ease of use. Additionally, the weapon was imbued with holy magic resistance as requested, making it reliable for any use. First, Rent tested it with his magical power. The blacksmith was astonished at how much Rent's magic power had increased. Next, they tested physical strength and holy magic. The sword proved its quality, withstanding powerful holy magic-infused strikes without damage. Furthermore, when Rent used holy magic to slice a wooden log, the cut piece began sprouting leaves. Amused, the blacksmith decided to plant the piece, curious to see if something unusual would grow from it. Curious about Rent's ability to use holy magic, the blacksmith asked about its origin. Rent explained that he used to repair abandoned shrines, which may have earned him a blessing from the gods. Rent also wanted to test combining 3 types of magical power, physical energy, and holy magic to see if it would amplify their effects. The blacksmith warned him against it, as such fusion was rare and could be dangerous. If the attempt failed, Rent's body might even explode. Still, Rent wanted to try, believing it could become a new trump card that would bring him closer to his dream of becoming a high-ranking adventurer. Reluctantly, the blacksmith handed Rent a different sword for testing, unwilling to risk damaging the newly crafted one. Rent began by channeling magical energy into the sword while reinforcing his body with physical energy. The sensation was extremely uncomfortable, as if forcing too much into an already full container. After enduring the strain for a while, Rent unleashed a strike that turned the entire wooden log into dust. That was only a trial. This time, he planned to add holy magic into the mix. Determined to become a high-ranking adventurer, Rent channeled all his magical power, physical energy, and holy magic into the sword, circulating the energy through his body. Watching from a distance, the blacksmith grew nervous and urged Rent to stop. However, Rent pressed on and finally unleashed a strike imbued with all three energies combined. The log was transformed into a sphere, and the sword crumbled to dust, unable to withstand the combined power of the three energies. Rent realized that the fusion of these energies caused the structural disintegration of the contacted object. The blacksmith advised Rent against using this technique frequently. Even though the sword was resistant to holy energy, it couldn't endure the combined force Rent had unleashed. Recalling the near-death experience from a powerful strike delivered by a girl he had faced previously, Rent asked if he could use this technique in situations where he was up against an overwhelmingly strong opponent. The blacksmith couldn't provide a definitive answer, but suggested crafting a batch of swords for Rent to use as expendable tools. After this incident, Rent realized that to reach a higher rank, he would also need superior equipment. While walking along the road, Rent saw someone desperately pleading with an adventurer to take on a quest outside the guild's approval. However, the adventurer refused, fearing repercussions from the guild. Seeing this injustice, Rent approached and handed some silver coins to the adventurer, dismissing them, before taking on the young man's request himself. When Rent inquired about the nature of the quest, the young man explained that it involved eliminating the Lord of the Lake. However, details about this entity were scarce and could only be discovered upon arrival. The young man, visibly exhausted, led Rent to his village. Understanding the fatigue from spending an entire day seeking help, Rent let the man rest. Before heading to the lake, Rent wanted to inform Vivi about the village. The village was located eastward, where unusual festivals were held. Recently, a legend had emerged about sacrificing maidens to the Lord of the Lake. To save the village from calamity, they were forced to offer a beautiful maiden with magical energy to the entity. Intrigued, Rent and Vivi both decided to investigate the creature responsible for consuming so many young women. The next victim was the young man's sister, which had driven him to seek help desperately. Rent believed the situation might not require confronting the Lord of the Lake. Perhaps rescuing the girl would suffice, without risking a direct battle. Upon reaching the village, Rent observed its desolation. The loss of many young women had sapped the village's vitality. Rent noted that women brought life to men, and their absence left the villagers unmotivated to work. The young man's sister was a sensible girl. Learning that her brother had sought help to save her, she adamantly refused, fearing it would endanger the village and her brother. Additionally, Rent's monstrous appearance made her doubt his reliability. Hearing her harsh words, Rent felt deeply hurt. Ultimately, she refused any assistance from adventurers, determined to avoid angering the Lord of the Lake. Rent, however, refused to back down, as he had already accepted her brother's request. The girl, left with no other option, reluctantly invited the stubborn adventurer into her home, but forbade him from interfering. The sacrificial ritual was scheduled for the following night. Seeing the girl's resignation, Rent realized reasoning with her would be futile. The young man, filled with love for his sister, vowed to prevent her sacrifice at any cost, even if it meant facing the villagers' wrath. Hearing this, Rent promised to do everything in his power to help. But first he needed to gather information. The next morning, while preparations for the sacrificial festival were underway, Rent probed for information about the Lord of the Lake. He noticed a group of suspicious merchants selling goods to the villagers specifically for the festival. Spotting Rent as an outsider, the merchants warned him against witnessing the ceremony, claiming the Lord of the Lake was enraged. Sensing something amiss, Rent feigned compliance. By afternoon, the sacrificial ceremony commenced. The villagers, filled with sorrow, wished for the young girl to reincarnate into a better life rather than endure the harshness of their current one. Her brother had tried to persuade the villagers to let her escape, but his pleas were in vain. The villagers feared that if the Lord of the Lake grew angry, it might destroy the entire village. As a result, they resigned themselves to sacrificing the girl. By evening, all preparations for the ritual were complete. Rent, Having finished his investigation, informed the young girl about his plan to save her life. He encouraged her to resist rather than give in, reminding her not to let her brother's efforts go to waste. Hearing this heartfelt advice, the girl found renewed motivation to keep fighting for her life. The ritual proceeded as usual. Rent and the brother acted as the boatman, taking the girl to meet the Lord of the Lake. As they approached the center of the lake, a thick mist enveloped them, but something felt off. The Lord of the Lake appeared, a giant octopus-like creature, but it was lifeless. Realizing this was merely an illusion, Rent exposed the culprits behind the deception. Thanks to a special item from Vivi, Rent was able to walk on water. He leaped straight through the phantom creature and discovered that the merchants selling goods for the sacrificial festival were the masterminds. Confident that Rent was weak and incapable of fighting back, they launched an attack. Rent swiftly capsized their boat and returned the criminals to the village for judgment. The siblings explained the truth to the villagers. The young women previously offered as sacrifices were still alive, imprisoned elsewhere to be sold to foreign lands for profit. With the quest resolved, Rent prepared to leave. The girl, now grateful for her savior, invited him to stay for a few days. However, Rent declined, stating someone was waiting for him. Realizing she couldn't convince him to stay, the girl ran after him and gave him a goodbye kiss, albeit through his mask filled with heartfelt emotion and a promise to meet again. After this incident, Rent concluded that the missing adventurers were unrelated to these criminals. He returned home to report everything to Vivi, crediting her water-walking shoes for making the task much easier. A few days later, Rent finally visited the guild to take on another quest. There, he noticed a job offering a single coin as a reward. These quests were usually considered charity work and rarely accepted. Surprisingly, the adventurers there were willing to take them on, seeing adventuring as not just a way to earn money, but also to help others. Rent met Sheila, who offered to help him find lighter quests if he wanted. Intrigued by the one-coin quest, Rent decided to accept it. The task involved collecting a flower that only bloomed near poisonous swamps. The flower had a romantic legend associated with it that Rent had heard before, but in this case, it was needed to make medicine. The client was a young girl who wished to use the flower to save someone important to her. Rent arrived at the girl's house and, as he was about to knock, the door handle broke off. Using slime jelly, he fixed it before meeting the girl. Mistaking him for a debt collector, she was startled at first. Rent clarified he was an adventurer. The children in the house were fascinated by Rent, but the girl, who appeared to be their caretaker, sternly warned them not to approach suspicious individuals. Though her words weren't meant to target Rent specifically, he agreed with her sentiment, advising the children never to trust strangers. Rent then asked the girl to speak freely with him. She introduced herself as Elise and explained the situation in detail. Elise took Rent to meet the nun overseeing the orphanage. The nun was ill, leaving Elise to care for the children in her stead. Due to their poverty, they couldn't afford to pay Rent much. The nun assumed Rent had come to complete a task to clean the orphanage's basement, as Elise hadn't disclosed everything to her. Later, Elise met with Rent privately and revealed the nun's illness was caused by excessive use of holy magic. The cure required the swamp flower to create a medicine. Elise hadn't told the nun about her condition because she feared the nun would leave the orphanage, be replaced by someone else, and resign herself to death. Rent decided to take on the quest, knowing that if he didn't, Elise would risk her own life to retrieve the flower. Rent decided to check the basement to handle the monsters mentioned by the nun. Once he descended, he discovered that the creatures were merely rats. The leader of the group suddenly lunged at him, biting his hand. Unexpectedly, the rat turned black and began obeying Rent's commands. Rent later asked Vivi about the incident. She explained that he had developed the ability to create minions. She encouraged Rent to keep the rat as a pet. When the rat bit Vivi's hand, it seemed to like her blood as well. Amused, Vivi decided to name the rat Edel and planned to use it for small experiments. The rat seemed fond of Vivi and behaved obediently. That night, Rent grew bored since he could not sleep. Vivi offered to cook something for him. She knew Rent was planning to visit the poisonous swamp nearby, a place rumored to house a semi-dragon creature. Rent expressed confidence in handling the situation, as he had purchased holy water to repel the creature, though he admitted it wasn't a foolproof solution. As they ate, Rent realized he could taste food again. Vivi revealed that she had mixed some of her blood into the dish to enhance his sense of taste. The next day, Rent arrived at the swamp. The coachman was scheduled to pick him up that evening. Although the area was dangerous, some unique plants growing there attracted visitors. While traversing the swamp, Rent encountered a group of goblins. These goblins were far stronger than those found in dungeons due to the harsh environment, which had honed their intelligence and pack tactics. Nonetheless, Rent quickly eliminated them with ease. Continuing his journey, Rent unexpectedly fell into the water and encountered a giant fish. He swiftly dealt with the creature while Edel watched from the sidelines. Meanwhile, Sheila visited Vivi and discussed the criminals Rent had captured earlier. Sheila wondered why Rent aspired to become the highest-ranked adventurer. Vivi admitted she had never asked Rent about his motivations, as adventurers typically avoided probing into each other's pasts. Sheila expressed concern for Rent on his current quest, but Vivi was confident in his ability to manage. At the swamp, Rent began to regret buying cheap, holy water. The semi-dragon found him and cornered him. Rent dodged its poisonous attacks and counterattacked, but both his magic and physical strikes were ineffective. Edel then used holy magic and leapt into the creature's mouth, forcing it to spit him out. Rent realized the semi-dragon was vulnerable to holy magic. Activating his own holy magic, he launched a counteroffensive. After dodging the creature's attacks, he successfully decapitated it. Acknowledging Edel's contribution, Rent placed the semi-dragon's head in his magical bag for later. Moving forward, Rent found the field of flowers Elias needed. Just as he was about to pick the flowers, he encountered an elf. The elf had also come to collect the flowers, having brought anti-poison gear and holy water to traverse the swamp. The two sat together to gather flowers. The elf only took one flower for his wife, who was also ill. Rent wished his wife a speedy recovery. The elf introduced himself as Isaac and expressed interest in befriending Rent. Isaac explained he needed someone to regularly deliver the flowers to his master, as they could not be preserved for long. He promised to reveal his master's identity if Rent accepted the request. Rent returned to the city and sought out Sheila at the guild. He asked her to help him handle the semi-dragon's body. Knowing the carcass would draw attention if processed in public, Sheila took him to a workshop owned by Dario, a specialist in handling monster remains. Dario recognized that Rent had killed the semi-dragon with a single strike, leaving the body largely intact. This would fetch a high price. Rent left the body with Dario and decided to visit the orphanage the next day. Sheila noted that Rent had grown stronger, but Rent dismissed the notion. To him, someone like Isaac represented true strength. Rent felt that his current power came not from effort or training, but from the circumstances of his transformation into a monster. The next day, Rent returned to the orphanage and reunited with Elias. He informed her that he had completed the quest. Two alchemists Elise had summoned examined the flower and found it to be in perfect condition. They planned to use it to cure the nun and then help others with the remaining flowers. Rent handed them a bag of flowers and encouraged them to use it to help as many people as needed. Rent then asked Elise if she still aspired to become an adventurer. She replied that she wanted to be an adventurer who helped others just like him. Rent mentioned that Edel's offspring would now guard the orphanage basement. He also offered to introduce Elise to a skilled magic teacher if she still wanted to pursue her dream. Elise, not wanting to overly rely on Rent, hesitated. Rent reassured her, saying she could owe him a debt that she could repay later. That evening, Rent asked Vivi to train Elise in the future. Vivi teased him, noting that he seemed to be meeting a lot of young girls recently. Rent, clueless about romance, tried to appease her by offering compliments. Vivi decided to let it slide, as the compliments were directed solely at her. The next morning, Rent went to the guild, where Sheila informed him that a prominent family had issued a quest specifically requesting him. Rent suspected this quest was from Isaac, who worked for a secretive family. Accepting the quest, Rent set out to meet them. Meanwhile, Eliza informed the nun of the truth through the alchemists. The nun prepared to leave, but was stopped when the medicine was ready. Realizing that Rent was the one who completed the quest, she stayed to hear more about him. Rent arrived at the family's estate, where the gatekeeper explained that ahead lay a maze garden created using magical tools. He shared that anyone who conquered the maze would be rewarded with another magical tool from the family. His only advice to Rent was, don't trust the sun. Rent ventured into the maze. Despite progressing far, his magical map failed to record his path. Frustrated, he decided to navigate without it. After wandering for some time, he admitted he was lost. Eventually, he stumbled upon a clearing where a girl was seated. She invited him to either continue on his way or stay and have tea with her. Rent noticed that both the teapot and kettle were magical tools. The teapot, capable of infinitely refilling itself with tea, was said to be worth 300 platinum coins, enough for someone to live comfortably for a lifetime. Rent marveled at the family's wealth. The girl recognized Rent's shape-shifting mask as a magical tool and offered to buy it. Rent knew selling it would yield a fortune, but explained that he couldn't remove it, as it was essential for his travels. The girl also cautioned him again, "Don't look at the sun." As Rent continued through the maze, he noticed the sun shifting unnaturally. When he threw a rock toward it, the rock vanished, confirming that relying on landmarks like the sun was futile. After a day of wandering, Rent finally reached the manor. Isaac and the girl, Leader, greeted him, impressed that he had deciphered the maze's rules. Leader introduced herself and guided Rent to discuss the quest and its reward. She offered him the chance to choose one magical tool from their vault. Led into the underground storage, Rent was amazed by the collection. Among the items were some peculiar tools, such as an endlessly bouncing ball. Rent's attention was caught by a toy airplane with a magical control system. While intrigued, he hesitated because the toy lacked practical utility. Latour explained that if he infused magic into the airplane, he could see through its perspective. However, the feature consumed significant magic and had limited range, making Rent unsure about selecting it. Deciding to explore further, he delved deeper into the vault to examine other magical tools. Suddenly, Rent accidentally touched something, causing several small fragments nearby to merge into a golem. The golem began attacking Rent. Isaac hurried to find something to stop it and asked Rent to buy him some time. The golem was incredibly strong, and Rent managed to sever one of its arms. Vivi had once told Rent that golems usually had a seal on their forehead that could be targeted to deactivate them. However, this golem lacked such a seal. Rent decided to use a combination technique to destroy it, but Lauder intervened just in time to stop the golem. She assured Isaac that they would clean up the mess later and asked Rent if he wanted to continue exploring. While exploring further, Rent discovered a vial of blood. Later revealed that it contained vampire blood, warning that no one who had consumed it had ever survived. Rent decided to take it, believing it might help him become a true vampire. On his way home, Rent also brought along the toy airplane. Vivi found it intriguing, as Isaac had gifted it to Rent. Isaac had requested Rent to deliver flowers to him periodically as part of a quest, and Rent agreed. As for the vial of blood, neither Rent nor Vivi was sure about the consequences of drinking it. Vivi admitted she didn't want Rent risking his life by drinking the blood. She told him that even if he remained a half-demon and stayed with her forever, she would be fine with it. However, knowing Rent's personality, she was certain he wouldn't listen. Becoming a high-ranking adventurer was his dream, after all. Vivi then remembered Sheila's earlier question and asked Rent why he wanted to become a high-ranking adventurer. Rent realized he had never told Vivi about his reasons. She hadn't asked before because Rent had once said that adventurers shouldn't pry into each other's pasts. Rent explained that his goal was revenge, though more accurately, it was to prevent tragedies from happening. He recounted that he used to live in a remote mountain village. At the age of 5, he had traveled outside the village with his parents for trade. Rent also had an older sister named Lynn, who longed to see the world, though Rent feared encountering bandits. Lynn teased him, saying he'd never become an adventurer if he remained so timid. Lynn had always been impulsive, often dragging Rent into trouble, for which she would be scolded. But one fateful day, their family was attacked. Their mother urged Rent and Lynn to flee. While their parents lost their lives, Lynn pulled Rent along as they fled from a monstrous wolf. Eventually, the wolf caught up to them. Lynn sacrificed her life to shield Rent from the wolf's fangs. At that moment, a warrior arrived and fought the wolf. After a prolonged battle, the wolf retreated. Rent, however, blamed the warrior for arriving too late. The warrior apologized and brought Rent and his family's remains back to the village. Rent asked the warrior how to become an adventurer. The warrior told him he'd have to wait 10 years before registering and advised him to train in martial arts and study during that time. The warrior also revealed that he was a high-ranking adventurer and challenged Rent to reach the same rank. If Rent succeeded, he could seek him out. While the warrior didn't specify where he would be, he assured Rent that he would still be active in the field if he were alive. 20 years had passed since then. Rent remained stuck at the bronze rank, but had never abandoned his determination. He wanted to personally slay the wolf that had destroyed his family and meet the warrior once more. Rent told Vivi that if he became strange after drinking the vampire blood, she shouldn't hesitate to put him down. Rent then drank the blood. At first, nothing happened, making him suspect it was fake. Suddenly, excruciating pain overwhelmed him. He collapsed as his body began undergoing a complete transformation. However, Vivi's voice kept his mind tethered. The next morning, Rent met his blacksmith friend, who was still working on crafting a better sword for him. Meanwhile, Elise and the children at the orphanage had begun dreaming of becoming adventurers. The nun acknowledged Eli's aspirations and thanked her for enabling her to stay at the orphanage. Meanwhile, Rai and Laura had recruited Rena into their team. Rent, having regained consciousness, reunited with Vivi. She wanted to examine what kind of creature Rent had evolved into, as he had successfully undergone evolution. Rent had regained his human body, but now possessed wings on his back. Vivi decided to investigate further to determine what kind of being Rent had become. His mouth now featured small fangs, and his eyes had turned red. However, these changes were relatively minor, allowing Rent to resume his life as his old self if he wished. Rent then decided to set out on a journey to find the warrior from his past. Vivi expressed her willingness to accompany him if he ever needed her support. And with that, the story continues. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe to keep up to date with the next episode.